Hello, everybody. It is a great pleasure to host today our session of the month of July of our workshop series on the social analysis of penalty across boundaries. We will have today as a presenter Javier Wilenmann. He is a professor at the University Adolfo Ibáñez in Chile, and he will present this new paper that is coming out in international criminology in these days, and against the Latin American current, analyzing the conditions of decarceration in Chile. Javier have been working on these topics of punishment and society studies for a while, particularly focusing in Chile, and he's the leading author of this paper. So thank you so much, Javier, for being with us today. We are very, very happy. As always, we will have this around 30 minutes of presentation by Javier, and then we will have the opportunity to make some questions and discuss the contents of the presentation. So thank you, Javier. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Maximo, for the introduction and for inviting me to present in this workshop. So I'm very honored and trying to take as much advantage as I can of this context. As Maximo explained, this presentation relates partly to a paper that we published this month in International Criminology, at least in the online version, in a special issue that was put together by Branda and by Maximo. This paper analyzes administrative data on prison entries and exits in Chile between 2007 and 2020 to understand the mechanisms that drove I would say, remarkable decarceration process that took place in the decade of the 2010s in Chile. This paper is co-authored with Pilar Larroulet of Rutgers University, Isabella Regada, who is there, of Old Dominion University in the US, and with Maximo as well. But I wanted to take advantage as well of this workshop to expose some very preliminary findings on a supplementary, a little bit more qualitative analysis of the same process that we have been carrying out, still not finished with it, with Pilar, which deals less with the mechanisms, administrative mechanism that produced this decarceration process, and more with the political process behind it. So the presentation will be mostly about the published piece of work that you can find in International Criminology, and it's open source. But we have another paper in which we're working now, and we don't know when we will be ready, whose preliminary findings we want to discuss with you, and also with well, everyone present in this workshop. Both papers deal with a very substantial process of decarceration that took place in Chile between 2012, 2011, and 2020. So let me start by contextualizing this phenomenon, this process in general. So our papers deal with Chile's incarcerated population. In general, as a matter of introduction, as in most countries, when we discuss changes in trends in the growth of prison population, we normally relate it to the study of punitivism, how it increases normally. This has been markedly the case in Latin America, where an important literature has used studies on prison population growth to signify a punitive turn that took place in the wake of the 20th century as countries transitioned to democracy. Explaining the causes of this evolution was a significant focus of punishment and society literature in Latin America, I would say, in the last decade. Chile has been usually studied under the same light. If we focus on its absolute prison population and growth rates up to the year 2010, Chile was a significant player, I would say, in the Latin American punitive turn. So if you look at the left image, you would see that Chile had a very high prison population by the 1990s and still had a very high prison population in the year 2010. The country transitioned to democracy in 1990, having one of the highest incarceration rates in the region, in South America, after an exceptionally long dictatorial government, by General Augusto Pinochet. During the early years of the new Chilean democracy, its prison population continued to grow from a very high base of around 200 incarcerated individuals per 100,000 inhabitants in 1990 to a peak of around 330 in 2010. The main period of growth in, I'm sorry, this is the main, so the main period of growth took place between 2000 and 2010. I can show you here this. So if you look at changes in the incarceration rate in Chile between the 1990s and the year 2020, you can see that there is a big increase in its prison population. Its prison population reached a peak in 2010. And most of it was driven during the early years of the year 2000s. Around 70%, 60% of this increase that took place in the Chilean system took place at that time when Chile had a new criminal procedure system implemented. So normally changes in state capacity associated with this reform have been, with more or less empirical basis, linked to this incarcerating process and this punitive process in Chile that took place in the 1990s and 2000s. If you look at Chile in the 1990s and in the 2000s, Chile would count perhaps as, one could say, the poster child of the Latin American punitive term. However, if you look at the time that came after this, in the 2010, in the years, in the decade of the 2010, the contrary phenomenon took place. So if we focus at the time, between 2011 and 2020, the Chilean incarceration rate per capita decreased by around 30%. But shifting the analysis from the period that ended in 2010, when it was going through a very high incarcerating wave, to a period that ended in 2020, Chile appears to go against the Latin American current, bringing forth a period of decarceration instead of higher incarceration rates. So again, if you look at this compared to other Latin American countries, you can see that changes in the whole period between 1990 and 2020 in the Chilean incarcerated population are in the lower end of the Latin American context. If you look only at the 2010s, you would see that Chile was going through a decarceration process, which was rather exceptional in the region. Only Mexico had something similar, no? And of course goes against some of the major players in incarcerating in the 2010s, like Ecuador or Brazil, which have been very much looked into. The limited literature that exists related to this phenomenon links it to specific policies taken by the first right-wing government since the return to democracy, which was the Piñera administration that went into office in 2010. And also to a prison fire that killed a very strong, important tragedy that killed 81 inmates in December 2010 in an overcrowded prison in Santiago, the San Miguel prison fire. As we will see, and I will explain, there is a lot of truth to this narrative. So this is our finding. Our findings are consistent, more or less, with the narrative around the causes of this decarceration process in Chile. But the explanations and the study of the decarceration process in Chile have normally been made en passant. What normally studied in Chile deals with the punitive term, with increasing incarcerating rates in the years 2000, much less with the decarceration process and looking more specifically into its causes. So our project seeks to understand better and to have a better idea about what went on at that time. What I want to present today is a project associated with the study of this remarkable experience of decarceration, which was rather exceptional in Latin America at the time. And as we will see, it was not sustainable. It proved also exceptional in time, not only in space. Our process has two parts. Our project has two parts. The first part, which is the part that is already published, aims at understanding the mechanisms behind the prison population decrease that took place in Chile in the 2010. So this is the work that we did with Pilar, with Isabel, and with Maximo, and which was published in International Criminology. In this paper, we seek to identify the drivers of prison population decrease in the 2010s following a decomposition methodology typically used in criminal justice studies on incarceration growth and the mechanism that drive it. This has been very much used in the US context. The methodology seeks to understand that the impact that each stage of decision-making in the process of incarcerating people has on the final outcome, based on the very obvious fact that incarceration is a process and not only an individual act. It doesn't only relate to one specific action, but rather a process that follows a sequence of decisions taken between very different agencies in the state system. So the central idea behind this literature is that since incarceration is an outcome associated with a many-stage process, we cannot know what caused a change in the total outcome, I mean with precision, without checking changes in each stage of the criminal justice process. We would be wrong. For example, we can wrongly, at a certain point, identify changes in increases in convictions as a driver of a growth in incarceration rate or a decrease in incarceration rates by looking only at changes in convictions, because they may be entirely explained by changes in the previous states. The police doing more arrests related and solving more crimes related to the crimes known to the police. At the same time, we would also identify individually changes in incarcerated convictions, which may be completely explained by the fact that we have more convictions and not only more incarcerating convictions. So at each stage in the criminal justice process is dependent on decisions that were taken in the previous stage. The idea is that to understand what part of the changes in what part of the criminal justice process drove changes in the behavior of the system in its final outcome, we have to study each stage conditional to what changed in the previous stage. Thus, in this paper, we study changes in crime occurrence per 100,000 inhabitants. Of course, this is all messy in terms of measure, but it's what we have. Then we also track changes in arrests made per 100,000, per 100 crimes known to the police, in order to control changes in arrest by changes in crimes known to the police. And we also study incarcerating outcomes per 100 arrests made. We also trace changes in the stay length associated with each entry to the prison system and look at the changes in the exits in the system. No? So to try to understand not only the role of changes in entries into the Chilean prison system, but also the exits in the Chilean prison system. This is the first step of our project, and this is what was published in International Criminology. In the second part, we want to understand the context that made possible these changes, going a little bit deeper into the motivations and discourses behind the legal, technical, and political decisions that in the first stage we identified as main drivers. This is a more qualitative work that we have been carrying out, interviewing key actors in the process at the time, in the Piñera administration and a little bit prior to that, and also studying press at the time and official documents associated with these policies. We build obviously on the literature on decomposition methodology, the study of changes in prison population. We also build on criminological literature on decarceration, which is a rather new literature on the field. And we also try to look at literature that explains policy changes in political science, particularly what is termed the multiple stream approach that we will discuss a little bit later. Before I start, just one important caveat, which is like the elephant in the room in this case, that relates to both projects. The Chilean decarceration process stopped in the year 2010 and then was completely reversed since 2022. If you look at Chilean prison population at the moment, it has again skyrocketed. Today's rates at absolute terms are much higher than they were at the peak of the 2010s. And if you look at rates per inhabitant, so per 100,000 inhabitant, they are more or less similar to what took place at the peak of the Chilean punitive term. So this is relevant, of course, to our history because it also shows, and I think it's important to understand in the Chilean history what makes decarceration processes not sustainable, which has been the case in the Chilean context. All right, so let me start by giving you a summary of our findings related to the first part of the project. I will be only presenting the main results of our analysis, not the whole analysis, mostly focused on 3 drivers of prison population decline in Chile in the 2010, according to our methodology. First, we look at changes in patterns of entries into the prison system. Entries are normally studied as more important than exits because exits are to a certain extent a lagged variable of entries. No? So everyone who enters prison has to go out. How you enter that to a certain extent causes the way you then exit. So entries are to a certain extent more important than exits study, even though we study both type of outcomes. If we look first at changes in the patterns of entries into Chilean prison population during our period of observation, the first thing that we observe, and which is in this graphic, in this plot, is a decrease in the efficacy of police activity through that time. It's not a very substantial decrease. Arrest per 100 crimes known to the police decreased, I would say, around 20% during our period. So this may be a driver of the fact that prison population declined. We cannot measure exactly what amount, what part of that decrease can be attributed to these changes in police efficacy, but there is a certain phenomenon going on at the time, reducing the number of arrest made in relationship to crimes known to the police. More important than this, sorry, this doesn't look very well, but more important than this, a very important driver in the Chilean story relates to changes in the type of entries into prisons during our period. We do not identify major changes in rates associated with prison entries per 100 arrests. So if you look at the data, I don't think I have that data in here, but if you would look at the data relating to how many entries per 100 arrests and going up in most cases, no, going marginally up. So you have a certain, at least apparent, gain in prosecutorial efficacy in relationship to police efficacy. It seems this seems to show that prosecutorial efficacy during our period in the 2010s did not decrease, maybe it even increased. There is a caveat to this. Unfortunately, because the way in which our data is structured and the way in which things are registered in Chile, we cannot directly measure with our data whether this pattern related to prisons entries is the resultant of the fact that the capacity of the system to produce prison sentences remains stable, increased, or decreased. This is a problem with our data. Our data does not label reliably entries as emanating from a conviction or from a pretrial custody decision, which is a very important driver of prison entries in Latin America. But other sources of information show that prison entries out of convictions per 100 arrests seem to have decreased. So if you look only at prison entries related to conviction during our period, and we do not have individual data for this, seem to have decreased. Because this is what I wanted to show, at the same time, pretrial custody decisions increased very substantially in the same period. Other data sources that we have also show that at the time, the rate of custodial sentences versus non-custodial sentences, the rate of non-custodial sentences versus custodial sentences, how many persons go to probation instead of going to prison, also seems to have increased, pointing to the fact that custodial sentences, convictions to prison, seem to have decreased if you look at their relationship to arrests made by the police. So as a summary, even though the number of prison entries per arrest appear flat, even a little bit increasing during a period, prison entries associated with convictions in particular, so prisons of sentenced population, appear to have decreased. And because of the fact that they were substituted in an important, even though we cannot measure this directly, but we can look at this at the aggregated data, by non-custodial sentences in Chile. So this is the summary of what I wanted to tell you. A very important driver of decarceration in Chile is the fact that non-custodial sentences increased in relationship to custodial sentences. So less people were being sent to prison because of the fact that they were being convicted. Finally, we found a very important decline in the average length of stay across all types of crimes, and specifically across more serious crimes. As we know, changes in lengths of stay could be driven by sentencing policy, so judges sentencing people to less years of prison and becoming more lenient, or for changes in policies related to early release, mostly parole. Our data shows a very significant increase in the number of parole decisions. I'm not sure, no, I don't have this, but I can promise you that this is the fact. A very substantial increase in the number of parole decisions starting in 2013. And based on a reform to parole law, regarding which I will be saying very little in a short while. This increase is consistent with the significant decline in length of stay among mostly the most serious offenses, which are the most impacted by the fact that you have more parole going on. In addition, the fact that a more significant part of prison entries was made of pretrial custody instead of convicted of sentences may also have driven the decrease in average stay time in prison. No? So you have been, if you're sending people to prison based on pretrial custody, normally they will go to less time into prison than when they are convicted. So this may also drive, in the average, less time that they spend in prison. Of course, we cannot look at this in detail because we don't have data individually on pretrial custody, but it seems to be the case. So the mechanism of servicing the data are consistent with, and this is our finding, with three policies that experts in Chile and the literature in Chile, the little literature that we have on decarceration relates to the decarceration process that took place in the 2010. These three policies were the following. First, very importantly, there was a change in the law that created and expanded on the use of probation and community supervision instead of prison sentences. A bill which was introduced in Parliament in 2008, so before the Piñera government in 2010, before the Chilean right came back to power in 2010, but which was approved with many very important changes in 2012, at the start of our period of decarceration. These new laws significantly expanded the type of alternative sanctions, community supervision to prison, including new forms of intensive probation, supervision, and community services. Second, there was a change in the administration of parole and in general in parole law that transferred the final responsibility for parole decisions from local agents of the Ministry of Justice, which were politically appointed and thus very reluctant to grant parole, to a judicial committee. This is another reform of the Piñera time. And third, there was a general pardon granted in 2012 that benefited around 4,000 sentenced persons, including 900 inmates housed in correctional facilities. Some of them were non-Chilean that were deported to their respective countries. As you can notice, all of these are policies which were the resultant of political decisions, of conscious political decisions led by the executive branch with support from the legislative branch. All these changes took place during a right-wing administration, the first right-wing administration in Chilean history since the end of the Pinochet dictatorship. So an administration that campaigned on a tough and crime platform. This is the campaign of the year 2000 of President Piñera. Delincuentes se les acabó la fiesta. Offenders, criminals, the party's over. This was the main subject of that campaign. An administration that campaigned toughly on a tough on crime platforms seems to have embraced consciously decarceration, a decarceration process through decarceration policies. Its decision led to a decrease in prison population, so it did have an impact. But what is important, maybe, in the Chilean case is trying to understand how this was possible, even though it seems less unlikely that such a change will take place. So why did a right-wing government that campaigned on such a platform created a package to decrease prison population? How can we understand this political will to decarcerate? There is not that much literature on decarceration that points to the different motivations behind such decisions. No? So we are looking at the little literature that there is on the subject. What we have to keep in mind, however, is that in context with strong punitive inclination, such as is the case in Chile, a country with very high endemic levels of fear and crime, a subject that Lucia Damer has looked very much in detail, a push for such a policy in a country like Chile appears counterintuitive and self-defeating from a political point of view. So in a country such as Chile, you don't want to be seen as soft on crime. If you are seen as a sort of soft on crime, you will probably pay a political cost related to this. So from a rational model or rational choice model, it seems hard to understand what type of driver, of political driver, may have pushed for this type of policy. We can, of course, always think on some sort of political returns that are beneficial linked to decarceration policies. In the US, a first type of return that has been very much discussed is fiscal. No? It deals with fiscal incentives. The main idea is that incarceration is very costly. So a decline in prison population may be motivated by state decision makers by the expected return of saving resources. This may be important for right-wing politicians to lower taxes or to left-wing politicians to be able to spend it elsewhere. So this is a first possible motivation behind such a policy. A second type of return, which appears less likely but is very important, deals with the negative consequences of incarceration. As you all know, and has been largely discussed by many different types of academic research, incarceration has very significant human cost, not only for those experiencing incarceration, but also for the families, for communities, and it may be also self-defeating in attempting to lower crime. So in theory, at least, policy actors may be motivated by the goal of reducing this type of harm. We can call this some sort of humanitarian frame to understand decarceration. Finally, a third type of return that has not been explored in the global north literature, but has been explored in former Soviet countries, deals what we can term prestige returns. No? This is a work, very interesting work done by Gavin Slade. Research done in the former Soviet countries connect the decrease in incarceration in countries such as Kazakhstan to the willingness to signal commitment to human rights, to the rule of law and democracy, to signal commitment to making now part of this type of countries which are more prestigious and which may bring investments and so forth into countries. So even though this type of explanation may be not that important for global north settings, where this can be taken more or less into account automatically, in regions such as the former Soviet Union or in Latin America, this may be something of importance. So our question is, what type of frame, what type of driver was dominant in the Chilean case at the time? The main idea that I will be presenting now, preliminary, is trying to understand changes in three dimensions connected to policies. First, policies need to connect to problems, to a definition and to a cultural understanding of what type of problem you're dealing with, which is not something automatic. The way in which you understand any type of political problem changes across time, and this is very much a cultural artifact. At the same time, policies also have to be framed culturally and align with the way in which a problem is being perceived. And of course, in order for a change to take place, a major policy change, the politics have to be right. You have to have a political opportunity. So what we want to understand is what made the connection between a fitting framing of a social problem with a fitting framing of policies to deal with it and a window of opportunity in politics made possible this change in Chile. So let me start by understanding, by making reference to the way in which the problem related to prison population was framed in Chile at the time. By 2010, the time at which we're looking, human rights organizations, some NGOs, and part of the academic community recognized that the country had achieved extremely high levels of prison population, even compared to other countries in the region. But as a political problem or as a political framing of the problem, this generated little general interest. For politicians at the time, this is what we have been discovering. What generated more interest regarding prison policy at the time was going on the opposite direction. What they opposed and what was driven or was one more present in the press at the time was a decrease in the judicial willingness to impose pretrial custody because of the criminal procedural reform that was going at the time. Remember, Chile, all of this is connected to the fact that Chile changed its criminal procedure system in the 2010s. And at the time, this was the main point being discussed. So the main problem at the time, in 2008, 2009, associated with the Chilean criminal justice system was the so-called revolving door, la puerta giratoria, caused by progressive judges, the so-called jueces garantistas. No? This is a frame that has been relevant across Latin America in the last years, the last decades, and that continues to emerge frequently to discuss about criminal justice in Chile and other countries of the region. If you look at criminal justice from this point of view, the problem obviously was not overcrowding, which was something not very much in the news at the time, but rather pretrial custody and how it was going down, even though convictions were going up at the time. So when the Chilean right came to power in 2010, overcrowding stopped being an absent problem. Right-wing ministers, the new right-wing minister of justice and security and so forth, had to deal with the fact that they had to administrate a growing and very overcrowded prison population, stop being something alien to them. During the first year, however, they defined this problem, the problem associated with a very high prison population. They defined it in maybe prestige frames, with what we saw in relationship to Gavin Slade's work, and also in technocratic security-driven concerns. No? So we have an interview which says, well, Chile at the time was now part of the OECD countries. We entered this club of rich countries. Chile, of course, wasn't that rich, but was entering this country, this club of country, and looking at our prison system, it was not pretty seeing how we had such a huge prison population. This went worse when there was the prison fire in Santiago in 2010. At the same time, from the Ministry of Justice, there was a certain insistence in making a more rational use of incarceration, trying to sort better prison population by levels of dangerousness and trying to only have in prisons the more dangerous offenders. So the problem of prison rates at the time was framed as a problem of conditions of confinement that require better management and better efficiency. During 2010, in the Ministry of Justice, one of the first steps, which was later it was later controversial, one of the first steps that the government took was hiring an international consulting firm in New York to analyze how they could improve the correctional system so it could lead to better outcomes in relationship to crime control. Now, the relationship between these definitions of the problem changed after the San Miguel prison fire in 2010. For a government, the Piñera government, that was seeing overcrowded prisons as a problem, this prison fire gave them an opportunity to reframe the problem. The problem stopped being inefficient in combating crime, stopped being having only a problem of prestige, if you want, and the very fact of having too many persons in prison became the problem in itself. No? The overuse of prison with the corresponding need of reducing prison population became the main definition, the main framing of the prison problem at the time. As the then Minister of Justice told us in the interview, we already had in 2010 the idea that we had to decompress somehow the system. But after the fire, it became urgent. No? We started seeing that we have to decarcerate. Those are his words, not mine. So the urgency allowed this movement, remarkably, in a right-wing government, to going from arguing for more smart incarceration, if you will, to decarceration as what they were seeking to achieve. Policies. What type of policies we had at the time? For change to occur, of course, you need also a policy solution that should be ready when the opportunity arises, aligned with a definition of the problem. No? So we need what we need to understand the way in which the Chilean system changed at the time is to understand what type of policy solutions were available at the time in which the prison population started being seen as a problem by politicians. In the case of Chile, as I told you, three policies were the main drivers of decarceration. So two of these three policies, the general pardon and mostly changes to probation and to community supervision, were already under discussion at the time. And this is an important part of the story. And they were already being discussed with lots of resistance when the San Miguel prison fire happened in 2010, in December 2010. The project to increase the use of probation was presented in 2008 during the Bachelet administration, the prior administration. But the project at the time only aimed at producing some marginal reforms and mostly focused on what the Ministry of Justice said, closing the gaps of impunity that occur when people do not follow their community supervision conditions. No? So they wanted to make it a little bit more stringent. Under the new administration, this project was taken into the docket of projects which was of interest to the Ministry of Justice, mostly because some individuals connected to prison reform were hired as part of the Ministry of Justice. But at the time, before the San Miguel prison fire, this project faced major opposition within the own governing coalition. So the right did not want to have more community supervision, even if the project was framed in a very narrow way, not decarcerating a lot of people, but rather closing gaps of impunity. So they had very limited success in the first time that they were trying to frame this project as some sort of technocratic, security-driven modernization of the Chilean prison system and community supervision system. After the fire, however, attacking the excessive number of prisoners became a direct goal, which was shared across the political spectrum. Now, this was the problem now. And now this policy, which had been discussed a couple of years before, became the right policy to tackle the problem, which was the number of people in prisons. So in the interviews that we have with different actors, they recognized their motivation to directly tackle overcrowding prisons and prison population with this policy. The same story can be told about parole reform that went at the time, and of course about the general pardon, whose direct goal was taking people out of prison. Finally, politics. It's important not to leave aside two political factors that may have made this reform possible in Chile at the time. The first factor is the fact that crime rates had been decreasing marginally at the time in Chile during the 2010s and the first half of during the 2000s and the first half of the 2010. More important, remember Chile is a country that has very high endemic levels of fear of crime. So even though crime normally, this is, if I remember correctly, yeah, the light blue line, even though crime is normally seen as the main concern, the main political concern by voters in Chile for most of the time, there was this very brief window of opportunity of time in which concern for crime as a political concern, as a political focus, became less stringent. At certain times during the Pereña administration, it was not even the first, but rather the second or third priority for the country. Also, there was a small, maybe, window of opportunity related to this. Perhaps more importantly, remember, in March 2010, Chile had its first right-wing government installed since the end of the military dictatorship. And while, even though it campaigned on a discourse of ending crime and ending with the party of crime, at the same time, it provided certain, I would say, advantages for a decarceration process. As one of our interviewers stated, the right in Chile, in particular, but I guess around the world, does not need to prove its credentials as being tough on crimes like the left has to prove. So for the right-wing government, aligning support from its own sector was more important. They could count on the left supporting their policies. And that proved very hard before the San Miguel fire. They had a lot of internal resistance, but then that resistance was all but broken because of the San Miguel prison fire. So and I'm ending with this. What do we learn from the Chilean case? Of course, I don't know much. I still don't know, but let me try to point to some certain points of discussion that may be of interest. As I said, the literature on decarceration is relatively new, so we cannot discuss that much with direct literature on the subject. But maybe 3 things that I can say. First, we think that the Chilean case shows how important it is to analyze proximate, very specific causes of changes in patterns of punishment, because those causes capture better the means and motivations from key actors and the real causes related to changes in prison population. We would say that more macro-sociological explanations related to the Chilean case appear widely out of context in our story. A second takeaway points to the conditions of success of different frames related to decarceration during that time. No? So when we speak about decarceration, we may be mixing different types of policy change. For a time in Chile, prison reform was mostly connected to frames associated with smart or rational use of incarceration and with humanitarian frames. We have to be tough on crime, but at the same time, we cannot be inhumane regarding them. These frames had and continue to have very limited success when related to tough on crime frames. No? They end up being defeated by tough on crime frames. So this may be a pessimistic takeaway from our study. Politically in Chile, rather 2 things seem to have made success more likely in the Chilean case. The fact that a mainstream right-wing administration took office at the time, softening the normal resistance to any soft on crime change, but by the right, by that political sector. And second, the fact that a tragedy allowed them to reframe the problem in terms of prison population and not only of security concerns, which is much less normally successful in driving this type of change. Finally, let me conclude with the elephant in the room, which is the fact that sadly the Chilean decarceration process was not sustainable in the long run. Prison population now is around 60,000 inmates, a number far larger than in 2010. If we control by population numbers, the numbers are rather similar to the very high wave of incarceration in the year 2010, at the end of the 2000s. So in just 2 years, between 2022, 3 years, and 2025, the whole process of decarceration was very much erased, and we're likely to face a growing prison population even worse than we faced 15 years ago. 2 factors, and I mean, there are more factors than this, but 2 factors seem connected to this increase. The first is looking at it in a more mechanical way. The first is a major growth of pretrial custody that has been going on in Chile in the last 3 years. Although the number of pretrial custody decisions, it went very much down in the 2000s and then started slowly going up in the 2010, it underwent an even steeper increase in the last 3 years. This has been mostly linked to pretrial custody incarceration of migrant populations. There is a story of revival of old instruments associated with new problems in here. No? As immigration control became a major political problem and a major bureaucratic problem in Chile, pretrial custody has been the most significant tool used by the Chilean bureaucracy to counter certain needs of control or will to control associated with immigration. The second mechanical change, is the fact that parole almost completely disappeared after 2019. Remember that parole was a driver of decarceration in Chile. A substantial increases in its use made prison stay shorter in Chile. But by 2018, this had provoked very strong backlash among politicians, both because of one horrible case in which a parolee for murder then murdered a couple of weeks after being released a young woman, and because of the form in which judges decided parole cases in an almost automatic way, which was very much subject to scandal. So after both scandal about the way in which judges decided and scandal about this particular case, parole numbers went almost down to 0. So they went from granting around 80% of parole petitions to almost zero in the last few years. There are many lessons that we can learn from this, of course, but I think one is rather obvious. Crime or fear of crime waves are likely to be faced by any country, especially by volatile countries such as Chile. So decarceration processes should take this into account. Mechanisms such as probation and parole are likely to face severe scrutiny, so the way in which they are made is, of course, very important to make them sustainable. Thank you very much. Hopefully I did take a lot of time. I'm sorry.
Thank you very much, Javier, for this very interesting presentation. We still have some time to talk about it. Yeah, fantastic.